Welcome to the National Soccer Coaches Association of America Winter Webinar Series. My name is David Newberry, and I'm the coordinator of the NSCAA's Club Standards Project, an initiative designed to raise the performance of coaches and players one club at a time. Since May 2012, we have had over 750 clubs representing over 540,000 players and 48,000 coaches join the project. The NSCAA is delighted today to introduce Scott Placek, an attorney, to present today's topic, I Didn't Know, So Sue Me, a webinar that is focusing on risk management for youth soccer clubs. Scott is from Austin, Texas, and he's an insurance litigator with over 20 years of experience as a coach and administrator in youth sports. He has served on the board of directors for 5 different youth organizations, including 2 terms as president, one of a 1,300 child program and another 1,000 players. A former collegiate soccer coach, Scott has also been the director of coaching for a select and recreational-based association. He is also, or has been, an ODP state team coach and a trainer for numerous select soccer teams. Through his company, Placek Consulting, Scott assists youth sports associations in creating and implementing risk management programs with an emphasis on child protection, volunteer screening, and loss prevention. He also serves as an expert witness in litigation related to the standard of care owed by a youth sports association to its members. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Dave. Good evening. I'm Scott Placek with Placek Consulting. Our website is soccerrisk.com. Placek Consulting is focused on developing model risk management policies for youth sports, but particularly for soccer. As Dave mentioned, I am an attorney, but as you can see, I've been involved both as a director of coaching, managing coaching staffs, and as a club president overseeing both recreational and select programs. So when I talk about risk management, I try and work from a practical standpoint, what really works in a club, and not just theory. My work in this area really started when I was hired as an expert witness in a coaching molestation case to answer the question of did the club meet its duty of care to the player who had been molested by his coach. And the more I dug into it, the more I thought, most clubs I've been a part of, I'd hate to be having to answer some of these questions. So my goal tonight, because we can't teach risk management in 25 minutes, my goal tonight is to get you thinking about whether your club is engaged in good risk management in all of the different areas that it's involved in. So if we're going to talk about that, we have to sort of ask ourselves, well, what is risk management? And I've given you a nice old business school definition of risk management and a photograph of what most people think when they read that. Risk management is really just a way of figuring out what liabilities and what exposures we might have as a club. And we're not talking just legal. We're talking financial, natural disaster, medical. What are the liabilities and exposures that our club has, and how do we eliminate them or at least minimize the exposure to our organization? Because if we can minimize the exposure to our organization, we're also minimizing the risk to our participants. And the key to risk management is it is a proactive process. It's looking ahead. Well, the problem that we have is that historically, youth sports clubs have been very reactive. They react to incidents after there's an arrest, after there's a complaint, after there's a lawsuit. Somebody once told me, whenever you give a presentation on risk management, start by saying lawsuit and molestation so everyone gets scared and pays attention. But that's really symptomatic of the problem. Risk management has to be a proactive process because once you've reached having a problem, it's too late to engage in risk management. But for most clubs, risk management tends to be an afterthought in what we do because it appears to be unrelated to our mission. Our mission is to teach soccer. It's to provide soccer competitions. But with volunteer-run clubs or even larger clubs that have overworked paid staff, what does that mean? Well, that means we have to get our registrations in. We have to get our field scheduled. We have to schedule the refs, manage the games, find the coaches. We've got to set up the pictures. We've got to deal with the parent complaints. Risk management slides way down the list because it doesn't appear to be part of the mission of the club. But in reality, when we think about it, risk management actually furthers our mission. Can we deliver a good soccer program to our participants if our goals tip over when the wind blows? Can our players learn if they're being sexually groomed by a predator coach? Can we pay our bills and put on our program if our treasurer is stealing money out of the club? Risk management is a way to make sure that we continue meeting our mission in not just now, but in the future. And this is increasingly important because volunteer organizations, and particularly those that work with youth, are more and more frequently becoming the targets in litigation when something does go wrong. We'd like to see every youth club put in place a written risk management plan and then enforce that plan. And in particular, think about having a risk management coordinator, somebody, it could be a new position or it could be the responsibility of someone on the board who is the contact, the go-to person for risk management issues. I think Georgia currently requires that, but I don't really know of any other states that do. Because we need to get out of asking, what do I do after something's already happened, and start asking, what do we need to be doing so that we can eliminate the risk that's out there and minimize the damage that comes from any other risk out there. And Dave reminds me that although this is a one-way webinar right now, you can submit your questions on the chat on any part of this. You don't have to wait till the end. Just feel free to send them in as we go through this, and we'll circle back at the end and talk about some of those questions. So with risk management, everyone thinks two things: background checks and goals that are anchored into the ground. But risk management talks about really every aspect of your club and your mission. On this slide, I've given you 5 headlines that have been pulled in just the last 6 months. You've got a weather risk. That was, I believe, in Florida, and I believe it was a youth football program. Child struck by lightning headed out to practice. An embezzlement issue, financial controls. There have actually, in the last 4 months, been 3 youth soccer club treasurers arrested for embezzlement. The soccer goal situation, that's been around since the 80s. There have been in excess of 20 deaths from unanchored soccer goals. It's a risk that anyone who has portable goals on their field has to face. The molester coach, that's the big one. None of us want to face that. None of us want to have to be presented with that situation. That headline was from 2 weeks ago out in California. And the last one, near and dear to my heart, the organization I'm with now had their concession stand destroyed by fire after vandalism in 2009. It's 2013, and they still don't have a concession stand because they had no insurance and they had no plan in place to minimize the risk that was out there. So risk management is a lot more than just doing background checks. It's a lot more than complying with whatever rules your state or your national body sends down. I'll give you a concrete example of that. Here in South Texas, we have what's called our annual goalpost inspection form. And before the seasonal year starts, somebody from the club has to go around and look at every goal and answer questions. And if it's a movable goal, make sure that it's anchored down, and they sign that off and they send it in the state association, and they've complied with the requirements. But what happens the first time the goals get moved for practice? All of a sudden, the anchored goal may not be anchored. How do you as a club know that the goals are going to be safe for game day? Can you rely on the referees not to start a game unless the goals are anchored? Well, maybe we can, but what about that field that doesn't have a game on it? What happens, and we've all seen this, The kids that are hanging around the park, they go running on that field, and what's the first thing they start doing? They start swinging on that goal. So how do we know and how do we make sure that that goal, even though it's not going to be used, is safe? Because the worst question that you ever want to hear if you end up in a lawsuit starts, could you have? You know, could you have required that the goals be inspected before the start of games every day? Sure, you could have, but you chose not to. Could you have required that all movable goals be chained together when they're not in use? Yes, but you chose not to. Could you have required that all goals be permanently anchored? Yes, but you chose not to. Could you have purchased only the tip-resistant goals for your movable goals? Yes, but you chose not to because they cost more money, right? You don't want to be on the end of answering those questions if you don't have the procedures and the policies in place to address the risks that are out there for you. You know, this is why the proactive process of risk management is so important. After the accident, it's too late. You might not have thought of something, but you can be sure that the lawyer who's representing the injured party is going to go out and find an expert who will say that you should have done that. On my business cards, when you flip them over on the back, the first thing that says is risk management does not begin and end with background checks. We have to understand that in terms of background checks, there are inherent limits to what those can tell us. Background checks identify people that have been convicted of certain predefined offenses over a certain predefined time period. And that's great. We want to identify those people. But we also need to think about what it doesn't tell us. Background checks sort of started coming into use in the 2002, 2003 time frame. They become more prevalent over the last 10 years as the cost has gone down, the simplicity has increased. But in some ways, I believe background checks are one of the worst things that's happened to risk management because they've become the crutch. They've become the excuse that the league relies on to say we're screening our coaches. And when I read these articles on the different situations that have arisen, it's amazing how many times the same quote appears from multitudes of different people just saying, well, he passed his background check. But that doesn't tell us much. Background checks should be a part, but only a part, of a comprehensive child protection plan that's part of your risk management process. Child protection policies focus not just on screening, but also how you manage your volunteer coaches or your staff coaches. I like to recommend that the screening process involves an application, an interview, and reference checking. And in sort of a best practices scenario, we talked about clubs establishing a volunteer screening committee of 3 to 5 people who will actually lay eyes on the volunteer before that person has contact with youth players. One of the things about the background checks, when you think about it, they become more and more automated. When I did mine in the fall, it was all done online. Now, who's to say that the person on one end of the computer is even the same person as they're saying they are when they fill out the background check? One of the reasons we like to have screening committees and we like to have them lay eyes is they can confirm the ID. They can look at that driver's license, talk to the person for 2 or 3 minutes, see are there any bad vibes, and say, you know, am I comfortable with them or do we need to look at them further? Of course, the concern that arises there is, well, we're going to scare volunteers away. But I don't really think that's a legitimate concern. You're talking about them having one more form to fill out in the form of an application and spending 2 or 3 minutes of their time at an interview at a function that they're going to be at anyway, whether it's a coach's meeting or a volunteer meeting. And 95% of these volunteers are going to be cleared without a problem. But if one of them raises a red flag and then resists your follow-up, I'm reminded of a story that came out of Nebraska a couple of months ago. A local town up there put a rule in place. Every youth sports association that uses city facilities has to do background checks. And sure enough, the president of the baseball league is quoted saying, oh, I'm just worried we're not going to be able to find coaches if they have to do this stuff. And the city council person had a really good response, which is, well, you know what? There are probably some people we ought to be scaring away. And that's really the truth. we have to remember, as a membership organization, we have control over who our members are. Nobody has a right to coach for us. While it's certainly noble to volunteer to help the kids, it's also a privilege for us to entrust the volunteer with the contact over those kids. And if the volunteer can't appreciate that level of trust that's being placed in them enough to comply with the screening, then we probably should be asking, is that a volunteer that we want? The other problem that we face, and the reason the reference checking is so important as we as we are in our current state of information that's available in background checks, is how do we get information from club to club? I live in a town that has 15 or 20 youth soccer clubs. If somebody leaves one under bad circumstances and comes over to our club, unless I go and check, I'm not going to know the circumstances of them leaving. And there was a case in Oregon just this last November that really, points that out. There's a gymnastics coach. He doubled as a sports photographer who was arrested when he was found with photographs of gymnasts in various states of undress. And what he was doing is he would videotape these girls in the changing room as he was doing their photos. And this guy got his photography gigs because of his connections as a gymnastics coach. Well, as it turned out, in 2000, he had been sued for sexual abuse in California. That's a civil matter, so it doesn't show up on the background check. He relocated to Oregon. He was hired and fired from one gymnastics school. The owner of that school refuses to say why, and you can imagine why at this point. Another school hired him, but they had no knowledge of his 2008 firing. None of that stuff would turn up on a background check. And without an effort to address information sharing, we're not going to progress in that area. And that's not really even on the state association radars right now. And that troubles me greatly because we have a far bigger problem with coaches that may go from one group to another under bad circumstances than people that we don't catch in a background check. And those of you that work with your state associations, I really urge you to give some thought to this information sharing process. These news stories I talked about, by the way, if you go to our website on the news section, we report on these various circumstances, and we also will give tips regarding the risk management issues that the reports raise. That's the screening end of it, but once you screen and put somebody in place, now you have to manage them. Your job's not done just because they passed the background check. You've got to have the right policies in place to make sure that the kids are safe when they're with your volunteers or even your staff coaches. We got a little cartoon here. Coaches at a tournament and says, oh, we've got a lot of competition, let's call a team meeting. I put this up here because of my next question. Well, where's this meeting? Is it in the coach's hotel room? Who's there? Does he have an assistant there? Is it just the coach and the girl sitting there? We don't know. When I was at the NSCAA convention last week, I talked with a couple of the insurance companies that were out there, and one of them said, whatever you do, tell these guys they've got to put a travel policy in place. Well, does your club have a travel policy? Does it say who can stay with who? Does it say who can transport people? Do you have a 2-adult policy? That's a very common one, but figuring out how it actually works is a little bit tricky. Is a husband and a wife really 2 adults? Or do you need to make them 2 unrelated adults? In this day and age, social media. Can your coaches be Facebook friends with their players? Can they send them text messages? Extra-organizational contact. This is a big one when you start to look at a lot of the arrests in the cases. You see things like the player was working with the coach at his job. The player was at the coach's house. The player was getting a ride from practice with the coach. Extra-organizational contact has to do with under what circumstances your volunteers should be having contact with the players outside of your organization. And those are really tricky to put together because you've got different situations. You've got the volunteer parent coach whose kid is friends with 3 kids on the team. They're going to see those kids outside your organization, whether you have a policy or not. Then you've got the paid staff coach without any kids who really has no reason to see a kid outside of the organization. Open doors policies. You know, a lot of clubs have meeting rooms. Can a coach take a player into that room and shut the door? You know, what if it's, you know, what if they're giving bad news? What if they're telling them, you know, you're off the team? You know, is it okay to shut the door then so the player has some privacy? Well, what's it going to look like when that player comes out of the room crying? These policies are in place to protect the kids, but the coaches as well, and that's really important as we implement them, that we educate the coaches that these policies are for their benefit as much as they are for the players. So we put these in place, we've got everything covered, right? Well, not exactly, because we've got vendors. We've got referees that come in from outside. We've got the people that come in and do photos. We've got repair guys. We might have security guards. And those vendors are in contact with youth players. So how do you screen them? How do you supervise them? And what happens after they leave? Think of the example of your picture person. That the person that does your club pictures walks out with the order forms, which are just chock full of contact information for kids and parents. And think back to that Oregon gymnast, sports photographer coach. He would photograph in the changing room. Well, you think, well, this is all done in our field. That's not a risk. So he picks up the phone and calls the parents and says, hey, your kid's picture didn't come out. Have him come by the studio. We'll do a reshoot. Oh, here's the changing room. How do we take care of things like that? Well, I recommend that every association have a standard vendor addendum that gets stapled to every contract they sign with every vendor. And part of that says, you don't contact our people outside of our organization. Other things that are important, certificates of insurance and becoming an additional insured on their policies. The very first lawsuit that I ever handled for a soccer club was a bouncy house. One of those bouncy houses at the tournaments ripped loose in the wind and carried some poor little girl about 400 yards before they were able to track it, and she got out bruised and bumps and sued the association and sued the bouncy house operators. Well, as it turns out, your standard state insurance policy doesn't cover bouncy houses. And the bouncy house operator, they didn't have insurance. So that youth soccer association was having to defend and settle that out of their pocket, and that could have been precluded using a standard vendor agreement. So that's sort of a summary of some of the issues that we see today. But I really want to encourage the proactive issues and the use of proactive risk management planning, because what we're looking at in the future is even scarier than what we're dealing with today. Standards of care change over time. 20 years ago, no one would have said, you know, you have a duty to do a background check on your coaches. Today, it's a part of every lawsuit. What we're seeing now is a move towards what's called the duty to warn, and this came out of a lawsuit in California where the Boy Scouts were sued under the theory that they should have warned parents and scouts about how to avoid sexual abuse and how to detect pedophiles. And the court let that go to a jury. They said they have a right to go forward on that theory. And now we're seeing it in lawsuits against soccer clubs. So are we reaching a point where we're going to be negligent if we don't educate about molestation? I don't think the standard's there yet, but we better have our eye on that. And we also better be working on the risk management end of things so we minimize that happening. You know, it's important to realize that the best risk management program can't eliminate every issue. You can have all the policies in place, and somebody can still break them. But having the policies in place increases the chance that we detect bad behavior early and have the chance to deal with it. And if we detect it, we have to deal with it because we don't want to be in a situation where we overlook people breaking our policies. But we can't eliminate all the risks, but we can minimize it with good risk management. So, you know, sort of to wrap up, because I know I'm running a little long, as you go back, I've got just a few recommendations. Number one, which is talk about risk management. Talk about it at the board meeting. What are we doing? And if you can't gain a consensus for putting together a full risk management plan, focus on one area at a time. Maybe it's putting good child protection policies in place. Maybe it's making sure that your vendors aren't exposing you to risk. But find one area, take care of that, and then move on to the next area. And most importantly, as you implement a risk management plan, do it early. Communicate with your stakeholders. Let the coaches know why we're doing this and how it's for their benefit as much as the players. Make it easy on them. Do as much of it online as you can. Make the interviews with your volunteers short and at a place where they have to be anyway. But get your buy-in through the education process. If you can frame risk management as something that furthers the mission of your organization and benefits your players and your coaches alike, then you have a lot better chance of putting a good risk management plan in place and